The French Navy, Marine Nationale or La Royale, in its previous iterations, was one of the world's preeminent naval powers in the Age of Sail, surpassed only by the might of the Royal Navy. However, as the Age of Sail came to a close, and the Age of Iron and Steam started to come into its own, the French Navy, although creating some of the first ships of the age like Gloire, began to fall behind other powers such as the Japanese, Americans, and Germans later in the 19th century. In their quest to keep up with other naval powers, they created some rather interesting looking and unique designs that no other nation could match, as the French were in a league of their own when it came to their odd designs. In today's video, we finally go look at the world's preeminent odd naval designer, the French Navy. With all of that being said in the introduction, the Marine Nationale has produced some excellent vessels, especially in the 20th century. Looking at the large destroyers starting with the Jaguar class, along with cruisers and of course capital ships. The Richelieu class were excellent battleships. It's just that a lot of their ships were unconventional and rather unique. Certainly in the late 19th century and even in the 20th century, of which the uniqueness can be boiled down to several components, in my humble opinion of course. 1. Tumblehome hulls, 2. Large superstructures, 3. Designed by committee / the independence of different naval yards, and 4. What naval tactics / building programs were in vogue, such as the Jeune École or Young School starting in the late 1800s. At least for a majority of the ships we will talk about today. Granted, there could be more or less, and if you agree or disagree or want to add to the list, please let me know down in the comments. The first ship we'll start with is the first-class coastal defense battleship Furieux, or Furious. I'll be honest with you all, my French isn't great, so I might do some translations. Looking at Furious here, she certainly meets the characteristics we laid out before. But to give you some more context to her construction, we have to go back to before 1875 when she first began to be laid down, even having a preceding class very similar in the Tonnerre class or Thunder class. Why was France building such coastal defense battleships? Well, following the collapse of the Second Empire and the defeat of the French armies in the Franco-Prussian War, the Navy, although remaining mostly intact following the defeat, faced new priorities and restrictions from the East. In this, the Navy took somewhat of a backseat to what it had been in the Second Empire, as Napoleon III was quite the ambitious man and naval planner, attempting to match the Royal Navy. Following his fall from power, the Navy took major budget cuts to focus on rebuilding the nation and army. For example, in 1872, the French army received 450 million francs, while the Navy received just 145 million francs. We're to quote from the French Fleet, Ship Strategy, and Operations 1870 to 1918 by Ruggero Stanglini and Michel Constantino. In the first half of the 1870s, the French Navy was forced to downsize its ambitions and consequently focus on two objectives: maintaining control of the Western Mediterranean, a vital task to ensure connections with Algeria, whose occupation had been completed in 1847 and would remain a critical factor in French naval planning over the coming decades, and ensuring the protection of its bases and coasts. There were further developing threats in the Mediterranean with the unification of Italy and the threat of the newly organized Reggio Marino would pose, in addition to new possessions like Tunisia, leading to some changes in policy. Nevertheless, this is the environment Furious was thought of in. On February 12, 1875, Minister of the Navy Montagnac de Chavance ordered the construction at Cherbourg of a copy of the Fumont Tonnerre class that had been named Furieux on 26 January 1875. She was one of several ships then building, that were then to carry steel 320mm guns instead of steel 274.4mm guns in their turrets. Taking from another excellent book, French Warships in the Age of Steam, 1859 to 1914, Design, Construction, Careers, and Fates by Stephen S. Roberts. On October 21, 1875, Minister Montagnac de Chavance ordered the Works Council to propose changes to the new first-class coast defense ships that were still being laid down. Recent gunnery trials against armored decks on the Brazilian Monte Javeri and Salemos, then building in France, suggested a need to increase their offensive and defensive strength without changing their displacement or cost. The Naval Defense Council, in other words, another committee to suggest design changes, they recommended similar changes as to their second-class coast defense ships, with 2 single 320mm guns, reduction in the diameter of the turrets, as well as improving deck protection and reduction in the breastwork, as well as superstructure. Interestingly enough, a stern fire would be obtained on each side of the superstructure as in the previous class, being required to reduce the width of the superstructure to 2 meters. Wherein these changes caused problems in June 1877 as the guns didn't have room to fire properly, and thus they had to rethink the entire design. This leads us to August of 1877, when the Naval Ministry suspended the building of the ship, and with that asking the original designer of the ship, Marie-Anne Louis Debussy, then serving elsewhere, to come back and redesign the ship and salvage what they had going on. Debussy submitted his first revised design on November 4th. Still, in December 1877, it was decided to change radically the disposition of the artillery and replace the single armored turret with 2 single barbettes on the center line forward and aft. This led to the adoption of twin screws, thus changing the machinery to accommodate an ammunition hoist on the center line for the after gun, which in turn required a complete redesign of the stern. See, this is why I avoided the Marine Nationale for so long. The Naval Defense Council in June of 1878, once the revisions were done, discussed the changes further. We're taking from Roberts again. It noted the overall purpose of the redesign had been to modify the configuration of the upper works and imitate to a certain degree what had been done in the large coast defense ships, the Indomitable class, that now carried 2 75-ton guns and 2 barbettes. The new design suppressed the armored breastwork, replaced the heavy single turret with 2 open barbettes, and reconfigured the entire hull and superstructure above the armored belt from 33 centimeters to 50 centimeters, the deck armor from 60 millimeters to 80 millimeters, 90 millimeters near the sides, and giving the barbettes 45 centimeters for armor. The 2 340mm guns, yes, another change, were carried 6.3 meters above the water instead of 4.89 meters for the 2 274mm guns of the Tonnerre, and both guns had 270-degree arcs of fire, one aft and one forward. Speed, range, and steering remained the same, but the single engine of the Tonnerre was replaced by 2 engines with 2 screws. The design draft was 10 centimeters more than Tonnerre, reducing the belt's height above the waterline from 90 centimeters to 80 centimeters. The council concluded that the many improvements were significant, but they were dearly bought at the expense of seagoing qualities, which it predicted based on stability calculations and the new hull configuration would be inferior to those of a new ship designed in one go. However, the council provided some technical recommendations on the design in case the money already spent on Furieux could not be abandoned. The Minister of Marine was not impressed with the council's suggestions to start over, and on July 9, 1878, approved Debussy's design and sent the plans to Cherbourg with the instructions to press the work as actively as possible. The naval constructors Garnier and Fenant were successfully put in charge of her construction and authored numerous modifications to her plans during construction. In March 1881, the ministry sent Cherbourg more changes, a plan to install lengthened 340mm guns in a barbette, later specifying that Furieux would get 340mm 21 caliber Model 1875 guns with a small powder chamber. 2 types of these guns had been designed, with Furieux getting one with the small powder chamber, something Schneider at Clouseau had specialized in since the mid-1870s. Thus, with this, the belt armor was reduced because of the quality increase in the material, and also because it was anticipated the ship was going to be overweight, and not by a little bit, but by a lot. In May 1885, the incomplete ship was found to be 325 tons overweight already, increasing her draft by 31 centimeters, and decreasing the height of her belt above the waterline by the same amount. The Naval Defense Council recommended removing some of the additional weaponry, like the 4 100mm guns, reducing the armor on parts of the superstructure, and reducing the number of shells for each big gun by half, from 80 to 40. Further changes happened to the ship whilst being constructed, but she was finally commissioned in late 1886. Now, Furieux would go on to serve with the Marine Nationale for a decade before some radical changes to the ship were proposed by Émile Bertin. In 1896, he proposed modernizing the ship's armament and machinery. It would take until November 1901 for Furieux to begin a reconstruction, where she completed it in 1904 and headed into the reserve in 1905, not too far off from when HMS Dreadnought would come into the world. World War I would hold her scrapping off, as she and several other ships were to be used to test the effects of underwater explosions. These tests were carried out against her and concluded in September 1917, where it was proposed to take parts of the ship's deck and use it as artillery shelters for the soldiers in the area of Verdun. Furieux was sold in 1923 and appeared as a wreck on the fleet list in 1924, with some attempting to salvage the ship up until 1939. The wreck's condition is not known today, but it's rather interesting for a ship to start. Next up, we have Dunkerque, a ship we've discussed in our own video, but any excuse I can have to discuss my favorite French ship, I'll take it. It also helps that she was a very interesting design. Anyway, the Marine Nationale was in a very interesting place after the First World War, namely in their capital ships. Because of the hardships of the Great War and the post-war environment not exactly being conducive to ship construction, even before the First World War, France had lost its status as a first-rate naval power, and because of these conditions, it was even more evident as they had already relegated their rather interesting pre-Dreadnoughts to training ships, and with the surviving dreadnoughts of the Corbeil and Bretagne classes getting rather old and experiencing troubles due to their age. Following the Washington Naval Treaty, the Marine Nationale had some concerns about foreign cruisers. Some of these fears included the Japanese using their new fast and heavily armed cruisers to cut off France's communications to her far eastern colonies, like French Indochina, and soon enough, another threat re-emerged, the rebuilding Reichsmarine. But the major concern was that of the rapidly growing and modernizing Regia Marina. French naval planners feared that the Italians would employ their new fast treaty cruisers against French shipping in the western Mediterranean and disrupt communication between France and her colonies in North Africa. Not to mention, the fast and increasingly independent striking force of Italian cruisers was going to be protected by air cover from Italian air bases in the Mediterranean islands of Sardinia, Sicily, and the mainland. After subsequent treaties in the 1930s, French designers looked at ships that weren't intended to fight in the line of battle, but be some new type of large cruiser or battle cruiser, eventually leading us to the design of the Dunkerque class. In the late 1920s, French naval designers put together some designs for these new large cruisers, including a 17,500-ton design dated to 1926. Designed to have sufficient speed and gunpowder to hunt down and kill lightly protected treaty cruisers. The ship's design was a rough outline of the future Dunkerque, having a top speed of 35 knots and a main armament of 8 305mm 55 caliber guns and 2 quadruple turrets forward. The design was attractive due to the speed and employment of already developed technology. With their armament, they could theoretically be placed in the line of battle, but due to their poor protection, left them vulnerable to the larger guns of enemy navies. Because of their speed advantage over the Italian dreadnoughts, the Marine Nationale felt that they could be used as scouts for the equally old French battle fleet. As tempting as this design was, the idea of a ship that couldn't fight in the line of battle eating into capital ship tonnage was found to not be very practical. In 1927, French designers increased the tonnage of what they wanted up to 37,000 tons and a 33-knot top speed, with 12 305mm guns and 3 quadruple turrets, 2 forward and 1 aft, along with 12 130mm guns, also in 3 quadruple turrets, and having similar anti-aircraft protection as the French cruisers Colbert and Foch, along with some trainable torpedo tubes for good measure. There were variations to this design, with a 27-knot variant armed with 406mm guns. The armor of these ships was an increase from the previous 17,500-ton design, something similar to the protection found on U.S. battleships of the Pennsylvania and Nevada classes, with heavy belt armor and a thick deck intended to resist plunging fire. The design also incorporated a new splinter deck below the main armored deck, covering up the machinery spaces and magazines. This design was not used for several reasons, with some of the main reasons being the financial state of France during this period and the fact that they did not have the naval infrastructure to develop a ship of this size, requiring a massive rework of French naval infrastructure. The First London Naval Treaty kicked the Marine Nationale into gear, so to speak. The financial strains placed on the country from the destruction of the First World War and the tumultuous times of the interwar period made capital ship construction a little hard to fathom, as I mentioned in the introduction for this section. With the international situation worsening and their rivalry with the Italians, which by this point was reaching a fever pitch, I know I've shoehorned this quote in before, but it's just so good. And to get some perspective, we will look at the Franco-Italian rivalry from current history, 1916 to 1940, volume 38, number 3 by B.Z. Goldberg, from June of 1933, who opens it up by saying, quote, "The immediate danger to the peace of Europe lies somewhere between Rome and the implacable Balkans, for Italy has dared to challenge French hegemony. Germany, despite all her potential might and menace, is but the background to the impending, possibly final struggle between Caesar and Gaul. Given these factors and the French battle line becoming an issue due to their age, it was clear the construction of capital ships could not be held off any longer. Even if they were able to get a design completed and laid down by 1931, the earliest it could be made ready for service would be 1935. And with the continued worsening of the international situation, this was not ideal. The time to act had come." The French Naval General Staff, in the wake of the London Naval Treaty, initially proposed several design tonnages for the new capital ships, with a minimum displacement of 23,333 tons and a max of 25,000 tons, and thought that they could have 3 of these ships. The General Staff had discussions, including other proposals. All of these proposals came with the rebuilding Reichsmarine in mind, as in the previous year in 1929, they had laid down the first Panzerschiff of the Deutschland class, where I've discussed those at length in my videos on the ships of that class. This heavily armed German cruiser caused quite the stir for the Marine Nationale because they wanted their ships to be able to have the armor and armament to fight these new German cruisers, eventually coming up with the design parameters as follows: a standard displacement of 25,000 tons, a main armament of 330mm guns and 2 quadruple turrets forward, a secondary of 130mm guns, protection sufficient to resist 280mm shells or a 500-pound bomb released at 3,000 meters, and underwater protection sufficient to resist a 300-kilogram charge. The tonnage increased to 26,500 tons to accommodate the increase in gun size. With these design specifications, the Marine Nationale thought they had a design that could handle the new German Panzerschiff threat in the Atlantic, and should the situation arise, they could assist the older heavy battleships of the Bretagne class against the Regia Marina. The order for Dunkerque was placed in October of 1932. It should be noted the designs of Dunkerque and Strasbourg, her sister ship, did vary in several areas. Dunkerque had a standard displacement of 26,500 tons, a normal displacement of 30,750 tons, and a full load displacement of 35,500 tons. Dunkerque had small tube boilers that gave steam to 4 geared steam turbines, which drove 4 shafts, producing around 107,000 shaft horsepower, giving the ship a design top speed of 29.5 knots. The main armament consisted of 8 330mm 52 caliber guns and 2 quadruple turrets forward. She had a secondary battery of 16 130mm guns and 3 quadruple and 2 twin mountings. Additional anti-aircraft firepower was provided by 10 37mm anti-aircraft guns and 5 twin mountings, and 32 13.2mm machine guns and 8 quad mountings. For some basics of the armor, her belt had a thickness of 225mm, and her deck had a thickness of 115mm. Her turrets had a face thickness of 330mm. Dunkerque was laid down in December 1932, launched in October 1935, and entered service in September 1938. Due to the Second World War, Dunkerque's career was rather short and somewhat uneventful. Again, to get her full story, link in the description. With one large exception at Mers El Kabir, where she received serious damage from British guns and then torpedoes. After lengthy patchwork, she was able to go to Toulon in early 1942. Following this, the Allied invasion of North Africa commenced, forcing the French to scuttle Dunkerque in dry dock, pretty much wrecking the ship. She was broken up piecemeal over the coming years, and work finished up in the mid-1950s. Finally, we have the battleship Massena from 1891, named for one of Napoleon Bonaparte's marshals. In the late 1880s, French battleship construction had been suspended and then resumed, with the powers that be favoring the Jeune École fleet composition that focused on smaller craft, where to take from Roberts again. During the 1880s and 1890s, all navies had to adjust to fundamental technological challenges, above all, the torpedo. In France, this adjustment involved heated polemics in the press and parliament by partisans of the Jeune École, literally young school, favoring torpedo boats as a replacement for the mastodon battleships, while much of the Navy and its civilian supporters defended battleships as the only lasting form of sea power. With this in mind, on January 7, 1886, Rear Admiral, I'm going to put this up on the screen because I can't pronounce it, the leader of the Jeune École that advocated, among other things, building torpedo boats in place of battleships, became Minister of the Navy. Now, he lasted until May of 1887, and for the sake of time, without delving too deep into it, battleship construction continued under a new minister. Along with that, in February 1887, with the renewal of the Triple Alliance between Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, there were calls for a stronger navy, and thus a rather ambitious naval building program that was to come about in 1890, which included the building of battleships. Massena was a part of a larger building program like I mentioned, and taking from Segalini and Cosentino, the 5 ships were built in 5 different dockyards/arsenals and shipyards, where the relevant construction managers introduced their significant modifications. Charles Martel, Carnot, and Jacques Gueberi were laid down in 1891. Massena followed in September 1892, and Beauvais in early 1893. Since the design modifications introduced by the dockyards and shipyards related to hull and superstructure, it is difficult to understand fully their logic, the only effective need being to avoid overloading and overcome stability issues. Taking into account the final result, it is safe to assume that these objectives were not reached. The 5 ships had in common only tumblehome hull shape and the layout of the main caliber guns, arranged in 4 single turrets, of which 2 were placed along the center line and 2 athwart ships on sponsons. This disposition would allow both broadside and forward fire, even though a trend of the time was going towards the line-ahead formations of capital ships that emphasized broadside fire. A new Minister of Marine, Minister Barbet, on January 28, 1891, called for plans for 2 battleships of the 1892 budget. One submission came from designers at Saint-Nazaire. Marie and Louis Debussy joined the firm as a consultant effectively after retiring as Inspector General in 1889. He felt that low freeboard hulls with rounded sides like Furieux and other ships he designed could both save weight and provide a stable gun platform. And in Massena, he combined this type of hull with a tall, narrow superstructure on the centerline, supporting guns and other fittings needed for a first-class battleship. Carnot had a similar layout. He extended the lower hull with a long ram-shaped, inverted bow, although the Naval Defense Council made him moderate it. He also favored vaulted sterns that were hauled out above the screws as in his previous designs, like the coastal defense battleships, giving Massena one also. A.C. Leroy wanted to try triple screws, an interesting design choice as they were still unproven in the French Navy. Still, it was accepted by the government, asking that the design changes included additional armor and 100mm quick-firing guns. Work commenced on the battleship in late 1892, keel laying coming somewhat later. During the construction, Schneider was asked to modify the 305mm and 274mm turret designs, the steel armor for the belt and for the turrets, and the rig was also altered. Leading us to a ship that had a standard displacement of 12,316 tons, as well as machinery for 13,500 indicated horsepower, and achieved 14,021 indicated horsepower on trials and a top speed of 17 knots. That machinery included 3 screws and 3 vertical triple expansion engines with 4 cylinders. Armor that was steel with a waterline belt of 450mm amidships, 350mm at the ends, with the turrets having 370mm as their maximum armor. The decks had a maximum thickness of 70mm, and a conning tower with 330mm as the maximum thickness. Now for the armament, 2 305mm guns, 2 274.4mm guns, 8 100mm guns, 2 65mm guns, 12 47mm guns, 5 37mm guns, 3 37mm revolving cannons, and torpedo tubes. Let's all take 10 seconds and appreciate the Massena's beauty. It is truly a ship of all time. Interestingly enough, on our trials, Massena with 3 screws in a vaulted stern, with a large single rudder, even after being enlarged during the trials, the single rudder struggled to maneuver the ship. The vaulted stern also pounded badly in rough weather. French ships with more conventional hull shapes and triple screws did not encounter these problems. Another little bit about her machinery comes from Staglini and Constantino. In Massena, there were 2 forward boiler rooms, which were surrounded by coal bunkers, a magazine, another boiler room, and 3 engine rooms. Each boiler room housed 8 boilers, while each engine room was a self-contained compartment with transverse and longitudinal watertight bulkheads. Now, each of these ships were built in this period spent a significant amount of time on the stocks, being completed in 1897 and 1898, where again taken from Staglini and Constantino. The resulting fleet of samples was a curious group of warships that proved to be only of modest use during the Great War. Massena remained on active duty until 1913, when she went out of service. Reduced to a hulk in 1915 and too old for participating in war missions, Massena was towed from Toulon to Cape Helles on the Gallipoli Peninsula by November 1915 and scuttled there to form a breakwater, protecting the evacuation of Allied expeditionary forces. There you have it, folks. This was our first delve into the French Navy for the Weird and Wacky Ship series. And what a first dive. We will certainly be coming back here because there are just way too many weird ships. But thank you all for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.